quite a small group, and I don't know if any of you are used to presenting on Zoom. It's quite challenging when you don't really have any feedback facially from your audience. So if you're able to put your videos on, then that would be great.
Nini, is that you? I see.
Yes.
I think I see you.
Hi,
He
how are
used to
you?
be at Georgia State University, one of the active students leading our animal rights group here on campus until she graduated and moved, which is what I hate about a student animal rights group, is that the students actually progress in their lives and leave. That's the worst. That's the worst for me.
I find my way back. I'm here with you right here.
That's right. That's right.
And the good news is that she's carrying on the work and paving it forward.
She is. She's looking for a career in animal advocacy.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. We actually talked about this. She's actually part of the Changemakers Writers Collective, and we talked about this literally just last week. So
good.
Small world. But welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this hour. It's obviously our pleasure that we have Professor Carrie Freeman with us here, we're going to be having a discussion based on her book, The Human Animal Earthling Identity. I'm sure you've all read Professor Carrie Freeman's bio, but just as a quick one, she is an associate professor of communication at Georgia State University, and she's also a critical cultural studies researcher and has published over 20 scholarly books and journals on media, ethics, strategy communication for social justice movements, and the media's construction of non-human animal and environmental issues. So on that note, before I kind of hand over to Carrie, I just want to say it is a small group, so keep your videos on. If you have questions whilst Carrie is presenting, then please type them in the chat. But essentially, Carrie will be presenting for about 35 minutes, and then we will have 20 minutes to have an open discussion and answer any questions. So, feel free to put a question or a comment in the chat, and we'll definitely address it after the presentation.
Yeah, or if there's something really pertinent while I'm talking, something that's confusing, you could chime in right then. But yeah, I was telling Cami at the end, I would like it to not just be like written comments, but for us to, you just to physically, ask a question and us have a talk about it. So.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. Well, on that note, Carrie, please feel free to take over and start the presentation.
Okay, that's great. And if you see somebody moving back here, it's my dog, Elliot, who's sleeping. But, well, hello, everyone. I have put together a presentation that is on my book, The Human Animal Earthling Identity. And so, but I tried to gear this presentation just towards you all as writers, because you're actually a perfect audience for the book, because I'm a communications professor. So this is about how to communicate, building stories around values, but framed kind of in inclusive ways. So all species are incorporated. And wait, let me go back a little. So the topics that we're discussing today is, I'm going to just start by letting you know what the goal of the book is, of what I was doing. And then I'm going to skip all the way to the end of the book and give you the good stuff, which is just the recommendations at the end of the values that I think we need to promote in society that foster this human animal earthling identity that I'm promoting here. And then we can talk also from a writing perspective, how do you frame these values in ways that are biocentric and inclusive? Because we'll also talk about the fact that, like somebody can be a kind person and that's great, but if they're only kind to people who look like them, that's not everything we need them to be. Like, we need it to be more inclusive. And then I'll end with a list of 13 project ideas or causes that I talk about in the book that could be useful for human rights, animal rights, and environmental causes to all work together on. And I thought I would include them also because that's also project areas, areas for you to build stories around, and you already are doing this, but it might give you some more ideas. So in terms of what I was doing in the goal of the book, is I wanted to identify values that advocacy communicators, activists, or writers like you could promote that are foundational to fostering and framing a more inclusive, life-centered, caring, altruistic worldview or identity, which I'm calling a human animal earthling identity. And really all I mean by that is almost exactly what it sounds like, that we all think we're part of the human race, that we identify with humanity on a broad scale that's not limited just to our ethnic groups. And then we also, the harder part for most people is then to say, oh, okay, I'm also part of the animal kingdom. So I identify with other animals as kin. And then just maybe the most humbling is to say I'm one species among many on this earth. So I share this planet with a lot of species. So I'm also an earthling. So I'm not this special species that the whole world revolves around or something. So and in a way the identity is so broad that you could say it's meaningless, right? Like it includes everybody. But I do understand that at some times certain aspects of our identity are more salient. And there's times when I really, things that are mostly in the human realm will be important to my daily life, but there's other times when I need to think of myself as an earthling and a fellow animal. And ideally, what I'm saying is that social change happens based on values and identity shifts in society, and not so much just about getting people to change their behavior or do the right thing. Because as I mentioned at the bottom here, the hope is that if we have an expanded sense of self and we see ourselves and connect ourselves with all these other individuals, that on an individual level will change, and then everybody changing individually will create a societal shift where all of us are inherently more sustainable and just towards living beings. So that's a more identity based approach to social change. Another aspect of the book is I'm feeling like all the social movements are working so hard against some common opponents, um, and just this exploitative society that we live in. And I feel like that we need to work together more and not just be so separate. So I'm going to be talking about three causes, and by that I mean the human rights causes, um, animal protection causes, and environmental causes. And so in this book, I was seeking ways that all of these three causes can work together. And when I talk about human animal earthling values, they are the shared values that I'm getting from all of these groups. Like, where do these values overlap? What do human rights, animal rights, and environmental groups all say that they care about? And then when we know what those things are, we can kind of frame them or apply them in ways that are inclusive of lots of different species. So in coming up with this list, I analyzed 16 global social movement organization campaigns, all the things that they're fighting for. And then I interviewed activists also from these groups. And so you can see the groups here because I tried to roughly put them to have an equal amount from a human rights perspective, from an animal perspective, and then an environmental perspective. And within each, I tried to have some diversity too. So like we've got some groups that focus more on feminist issues like care, political issues like Amnesty International, LGBTQ issues. I had the Anti-Slavery International group in there to make sure we were talking about human enslavement. With the animal protection group, I have some like rainforest and I have some ocean-oriented groups. I have some welfare type groups like the International Fund for Animal Welfare and World Wildlife Fund to a large extent. And then I have some animal rights groups like PETA and Animal Equality. And then in the environmental group, also tried to have some diversity there. We've got 350.org, which is a climate group. And then we've got, again, the ocean. Oh, I mentioned rainforest and oceans a little bit too early when I mentioned them with the animal protection group. But I tried to, in the environmental category, have ocean and land-based groups as well. And it's also, it overlaps a lot between animal protection and environmentalism because like World Wildlife Fund and the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society would probably qualify themselves more as conservation groups and not animal groups, but I kind of put them in there. So, but I'm actually going to skip over all the details that are in the book where I explain basically by looking at all these groups and asking, okay, who do they care about? What do they say is good? What do they say is bad? And making all these lists. Um, I really got to know everything that's wrong with the world. Like when I was doing this, it was completely depressing, which I think a lot of your work, you get that way too, is you have to immerse yourself in the worst things that are going on. And in this case, I knew what was going on with every single being, the exploitation of every kind of being in every kind of way. But at least when you're studying social movements, they're more positive because they're like, this, this is going down right now and this is horrific, but I think we can do these things and we can make it better. So there always is something that's more hopeful about it. And I wanted to share, before I get into what the values are that overlap between them, I wanted to say that when I was interviewing people from all these groups, and I did some extra interviews too, nobody really argued with the idea that, yeah, we should be working together, all these groups, and that we do have some things in common. Even though we did talk about a lot of the challenges of actually forming alliances and coalitions, which I'm not really getting into right now, but it's in the book, their recommendations for alliances. But in just thinking about some things they have in common, one thing that they all fight for is a general respect for life, all different kinds of living beings. And the notion that we're all living on the same planet, we're all interdependent. And so we need to have healthy communities and that we have to rely on each other for that. And there is a quote here from Rainforest Action Network, Laurel Sutherland. And he was saying, if you start with a commitment to justice, equity, and ecological health, so he's mentioning some values that he thinks are generally important, you come to the same conclusion about how animals, people, and landscapes should be treated. The three causes are inextricable. They're really just one movement. So that to me was a really important quote for the book, saying that's really kind of right on target. Like, yeah, we're all really fighting for the same thing and we should be working together. So then also saying, okay, well, what are we fighting against? What we're doing together is we're fighting for respect and health and well-being. What we're fighting against at a very basic level is harm to living beings. And so in the types of harm, especially, are violence, cruelty, oppression, discrimination, exploitation, environmental degradation, and concentrated power, misuse of power, and in particular, also dealing with democratic reform. And Frances Moore Lappé, someone I interviewed, says that democratic reform is a movement of movements. Like we all need to be working to make sure that we don't have authoritarian governments or corrupt governments that are run just by kind of corporate interests. And the climate crisis also qualifies as, in a way, as a movement of movements, that all movements can get around that issue. And I think they are. And here's a nice quote from Eric Pica of Friends of the Earth. He says, all three of us are fighting against this system that's built on exploitation, whose main purpose and goal is to turn people and things and animals into commodities that are meant to be kind of used and abused and thrown away for this ever-growing, for this ever insatiable appetite for profits and wealth concentration. So he was really blunt about that. And really, Friends of the Earth is, I would say that they're really more of like an environmental justice or almost like a human rights group in the way they operate, very much against kind of neoliberal politics. So this next part is I'm going to be sharing a whole bunch of values with you. Like I'm just going to be running through lists of values. So it's too much for you to take notes on, but on my website, humananimalEarthlings.com, there is a list from the last chapter in the book of all these values that I identified that all groups work on, human rights, animal protection, and environmental groups. And I categorize them into 4 categories: values relating to life, fairness, responsibility, and unity. And the values are things that are nouns and verbs. They're like things or concepts we think are important and actions we think are important. Okay. So I'll start with the life category. And I have them each just listed in alphabetical order. I put food in this category because it's so essential to life. Agroecology and sustainable crop farming. And notice I said crop farming and not animal farming in terms of what a human animal earthling should value. Biological diversity, caretaking, aiding and helping others, especially those who are dependent on us. health and well-being, in both physical and mental health and well-being. Life-saving, of course, is in the life category. Livelihood, ensuring access to needed resources. Naturalness, meaning like non-toxic environments that we live in. Peacefulness and nonviolence are supporting life. The very notion of protection, that gets brought up so much by all these social movements. So protecting anyone from threats, basically, and risks. Restoration and healing, and that could also mean restoring species who are endangered. Safe, secure, and clean habitats or living spaces, meaning that you can't have to support life, we all need a safe place to be and to live. And this could include wilderness habitat spaces as well as our homes and cities. And then sanctuaries and reserves are necessary to support life, as well as a stable climate got brought up a lot as well. Oops. Okay, so value supporting fairness or justice. The first one is coexistence, cultural diversity and inclusivity. And recently I saw a saying that said, diversity is a fact, inclusivity is an act. And I liked that because, again, that shows that we choose to be inclusive. And that's why we're expanding the notion of diversity to include equity and inclusivity. Democratic decision making and people power. So making sure that we have democratic ways of making decisions that are fair and include everyone. Equality and equity are huge parts of being fair, as well as fairness and justice, obviously. The term freedom or liberty is used a lot. It can mean a lot of things, but in general, that's freedom over someone's body, their speech, mobility, labor, and life choices. In this category is also legal protection and enforcement by government, because a lot of times what we're fighting for is laws to change, and then those laws need to be enforced, and the laws need to be fair. And then reparation for harms and some kind of compensation for harms caused is part of fairness. Respect is a value, I think, that's at the heart of fairness. Like if you have to have respect for humans, other animals, and nature before you're going to care about treating them well, I think. Rights also fall in this category of fairness, protection of rights for sentient individuals and ecosystems. And the notion of sharing gets to fairness too. Like, are we sharing the planet and the resources with all species, with all people? And that also gets to the notion of territory and land rights. Land rights gets mentioned a lot. Access to meaningful, traditional, or vital spaces for a particular groups and communities or species. And then this last one is wildness in nature. So it's not wilderness, it's the notion of wildness. The idea that not everybody wants to be domesticated. So if you don't want to be domesticated, like we also have to, it's fine for those areas that are domesticated, or those of us who might consider ourselves domesticated, but for those who want to be wild or areas that are quote unquote undeveloped, that's something to be valued as well. So in this responsibility category, we'll start with being accountable for our actions, especially holding anyone accountable for anything they've done that's harmful. Being responsible, taking responsibility to do the right thing. Careful and wise actions, like following the precautionary principle and avoiding unnecessary risks. You especially see this in the environmental movement with not wanting to kind of move forward with using all these chemicals when we don't know all the different problems they're going to cause. Collective action for problem solving. So you're going to see a lot of kind of activist stuff in this category here. And it's probably not a surprise that if I look for values among social movement campaigns, you're going to see a lot of them saying, hey, we need to get involved. But I think that's part of a human animal earthling identity, is not to be apathetic. And it's not all about consumerism, but when we are consumers, that is a part of our lives, it should be conscientious consumption. So this is where I can put also the veganism in there, cruelty-free, fair trade, organic, living wage. Education comes into this category too, that a responsible society educates others, not just children, but adults. And that's what you all do as writers. You're constantly educating and raising awareness and sharing knowledge. And then empowerment, as well as providing agency. Like for those who really need empowerment are those who are marginalized groups and they need help in raising their voices and their interests. Then we have engaged political citizenship and commitment to causes. Integrity, this is one of my favorite values, and it can mean a lot of things, but there's moral integrity. And then there's also authenticity of research and information, which is important to your writing too. Like it doesn't, you can write something that's very compelling, but if people don't trust it, or you've fudged some of the quotes, or you don't have quality sources and credible information, then that's a problem. Investment in a sustainable future. So thinking long-term about ecological responsibility and engaging in practices and policies that think long-term. Productivity, this one maybe seems a little bit bland, like what's so big about this? But I think I noticed that a lot of the groups, they want to say, hey, we're doing something and this is going to make a difference. So it's kind of like effective altruism, this notion that we want to engage in problem solving that is going to work. Speaking out and challenging abuses of power is something, peaceful protest is something we should be valuing and doing. Sustainable and wise use of natural resources or preservation of natural resources, as well as truth telling and transparency, although that can go in the integrity category and also in the education category, that we need to be truth telling. Because of course, a lot of the problems that we're facing in society is misinformation that's being put out, whether it's by corporations or governments or different groups. Okay, and so then the last category is supporting unity. And so this one it's kind of a tricky category but I put things here I guess I thought either bring us together or everyone can relate to. So I put biocentrism here, this notion of being life-centered and not just centered around humans, or not just centered around groups like larger species groups, but around individual lives. Community certainly is about unity. Compassion and empathy for sentient beings. I think that's at the basis of what brings us together and helps us care, along with respect. Dignity. And this is not something, we don't use this term a lot in the animal protection movement because it usually is ascribed to humans. But I will say that in general, I think any sentient being has a need to maintain self-respect. And it might be a certain kind of way you carry yourself, or a certain cleanliness, or freedoms that you have. So there's a lot kind of wrapped up in this. But I think there's ways to promote human dignity that don't necessarily mean that that don't diminish other animals. The notion of family is important, and you see that especially in human rights, but in animal protection, we can bring in family as well. Harmony and cooperation. Humility, I'm the one that really adds this in there because I think human arrogance is really the cause of so many problems. And so humility, especially for humans, is going to help bring us together. Love and friendship gets mentioned a lot. And again, it's usually more in the animal protection and human rights area and not really in environmentalism. But I also have biophilia there, which is love for nature. Inclusivity and openness, of course, is important for us to have unity. Notions of interdependence, that we're ecologically, socially, and economically joined together. Just the very notion of having solidarity is important. And then understanding, because when we're seeking truth, that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is get to a sense of understanding. But that also means being compassionate and trying to understand those who are different from us. Okay, so that's the end of all those human animal earthling identity values. Now, this next slide that I'm going to show you is one where I took them and I condensed them down into virtues that a person could have, because the other things were concepts that we value or actions we can take. So in this case, I'm saying a human animal earthling is someone who has these 20 virtues, and someone who then applies them towards lots of different species and doesn't just limit it to a certain group. And so I thought this might be interesting for you when you're doing feature stories on certain impressive people, that, that you can highlight certain virtues that they embody, and also how that's extended out in different ways towards all different kinds of groups. So a human, animal, earthling, these are all adjectives, and it's alphabetical again. That person is accountable for what they're doing. They're caring, they're compassionate and kind, they're committed, cooperative, courageous, fair, giving, honest and authentic, humble, humorous. I add that in just because nobody likes somebody who's like too serious. A person of integrity, open-minded, peaceful, prudent or careful, respectful, responsible, trustworthy, understanding, and wise. So again, I hope maybe some of these things just give you ideas about stories that you can write and what you can accentuate in the storytelling about a certain impressive human or non-human animals. And then I also wanted to say, okay, we've got all these values, but they need to be framed in a way that's biocentric or life-centered and much more inclusive of many different types of beings in the world, because most of what we're brought up to do is to apply values towards humans. And then even some of us are very limited in which humans we're privileging, right? And there's all kinds of discrimination within the human realm. So this idea is trying to find ways, just reminding all the social movements that we need to be kind of more open with who we're applying these things to. Now, there's too much on this slide, but I also just wanted to show that I do pull from a lot of literature. Like there's, I think, like 250 sources in the book. So there's a lot in the book. So it's not, when I'm coming up with recommendations, they're not just based on the empirical study of looking at all these groups. It also was scholarship by people in the humanities and social sciences and the hard sciences. But this part is just kind of explaining, even though I don't think I really have to convince you all about why we should frame things biocentrically, why that's important. But Crompton and Kasser they were some researchers that studied strategic change for the World Wildlife Fund. And they're saying in environmental campaigns and social justice campaigns, you do want to reduce discrimination against animals, non-human animals, by reminding humans that they're part of the animal kingdom and the natural world. So you're telling people to be empathetic and to care about equality, but also to apply it to non-human animals too. Because you don't always hear other groups saying this. I mean, obviously you hear people who are just into kind of animal studies saying this, but I liked they basically do mostly environmental and conservation strategic research. So I was happy that they were addressing the fact that they don't want it to be just anthropocentric, our approach. And then there are some studies related to environmental identity by Susan Clayton. And that's just, when someone has an environmental identity, they understand that they're interdependent with all different living beings. And if you have that sense of yourself, you are somebody who's more likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviors, and someone who's more likely to believe that animals have rights and that we need to consider other species when we start making decisions. And that's, so really, in a way, the human animal earthling identity is a form of this environmental identity. I'm just kind of foregrounding the human and the animal part a little bit as well. And then I also wanted to include this study by Costello and Hodson, which I thought was really interesting. It's like a social science study proving that people who believe in the human animal dualism, or the hierarchies and the separation between humans and the animal species, are more likely to be racist or have like racially biased views as well, or engage in some thoughts that are dehumanizing. So I thought this was really interesting because, of course, we do a lot of theorizing, and I draw a lot in the book from so many of our fantastic scholars who study the connection between species and race in terms of discrimination, particularly Aff and Silko and Claire Jean Kim and Breeze Harper. And so I draw a lot upon them in here, but that's their work is a little bit more in the humanities, but I thought this was interesting that there's also some studies that can kind of prove it's bad for society to have these hierarchies where we think that other animals are so separate from us. It causes problems for humans too. And so these social scientists were saying like, well, it actually helps if we say, hey, these other animals are like us. The more we do that, that actually can reduce racial biases. And in another thing that I'd written, I was saying, yes, we should definitely be talking about us as animals, that we're all humans are equally animal. But I also think it should go in the other direction. And we should make sure that we're not just saying, oh, isn't it impressive? These elephants have so much in common with us, or these chimpanzees have so much in common with us, or the dolphins or whoever, that we also need to be saying like, oh, there's a lot of amazing beings in the world, and I'd like to have something in common with them. Like maybe there's things that a bee colony does that I would like to emulate in my social group, or pigeons, or a mother hen, or something like that. So that also leads to this section I have on the side where some of my work on deconstructing the human animal dualism says that when we're talking about animal advocacy, we need to make sure we're bringing in rhetoric that embraces continuity and diversity, meaning sometimes we're pointing out the kinship with other animals, but we're also saying that we appreciate the diversity among species. And this is true of any social movement where you don't want to just talk about assimilation, right? Like if the human rights movement just talks about how we're all the same, then we don't, acknowledge diversity. And I think that early on in some of the like civil rights movement and women's rights, we were doing that. And then suddenly we've recognized the notion of diversity. Diversity is not something we tend to bring up a lot in animal rights realms, because we're focusing so much on the fact that other animals have so much like us, or they're also sentient beings. So it is important to focus on what we have in common. But one of the problems, and I think you all know this, is that we get into this trap then where it's almost like we're saying if they're not very much like us, then they don't deserve to have rights or be considered. So then we start privileging mammals and over fish, and then we get into all these problems and over invertebrates and insects and things like that. So is there a way that we can recognize and appreciate the diversity while still recognizing on maybe a broader scale what we have in common with other animals? So here's just some examples of biocentric framing. And what you have in blue here are all the, like not all, but some of the examples from that Human Animal Earthling values list of mine. So I'm just saying like, okay, if we're talking about life-saving, health and well-being, family, love and friendship, let's not just talk about it in terms of humans, like applying it just to humans. Let's have a diversity of human groups as well as other species. So life-saving is important for saving the lives of salmon and old growth trees. Health and well-being isn't just humans. Of course, now we're in a pandemic. It seems like all we're talking about is public health and human health. But we also have the well-being of injured hawks who might need to go to a sanctuary, or obviously our companion animals that need to go to veterinarians. When we talk about family, we have asylum-seeking human families that need to be kept together and respect for their family units, but also respect for keeping families of elephants together in reserves and not just kind of moving animals around without a concern for who they're attached to, and for not separating families of animals like cats or cows who are in human care, because of course that happens all the time, is we're constantly controlling domesticated animals and separating them. Love and friendship, we can show respect for interspecies friendships and the social bonds that form and make life worth living for social animals, that we all want to choose who we partner up with and who we're friends with. Reparation for harms. Oops, didn't mean to go back. For this part, there's a lot to be said here, given the amount of harm that we have to account for here, but we have indigenous groups who need to have land rights. We have human groups who've been enslaved in the past, and many millions of humans who are being enslaved now illegally who need reparations. We have forests that need rewilding and regeneration, rivers that could use to have a dam removed from them. We have toxic mining sites that need cleanup. We have an atmosphere that needs cleansing of pollutants. And this made me think also of Lori Marino's whale sanctuary project, where a lot of times people will say to her, like, oh, well, what's the point of creating a whale sanctuary? You can't house that many whales, so it's not really worth the time and effort. But she sees it as a form of reparation. Like, these animals have lived in tanks and been held in captivity. And even if we can't release them into the wild, into the splendor of their entire habitat, if we had an open pen sea sanctuary, we can repair some of the damage and give back some of what they deserve. And we do this too for animals who've been in research labs or in circuses. You try to kind of retire them to sanctuaries. It can't make up for everything, but it's something. And just three more examples here. In the freedom category, normally we think about freedom, we think about humans and liberty, but freedom can mean mobility for bears to migrate between parks and not to be kind of held in a park. And so this would mean having a lot of wildlife corridors, safe ways for animals to go wherever they want to in terms of their territory. And freedom could also mean for a goat not to be kept, bred, and killed and milked for food, like to not have all of these choices made for them and be dominated in that way. Again, most of society thinks kind of domestication of farmed animals is just a benign issue. But if you frame it in terms of freedom and choice and justice, which I tend to do, we can see it more as kind of an imprisonment situation. Livelihood is, again, usually a word, and we think about that now a lot during the pandemic because so many people's livelihoods have been taken away. But it really is for any human or non-human. You have access to the resources you need to survive and thrive. So shelter, water, food, habitat, and for us, it might be all this kind of computer equipment. There's a lot that goes into things, but other animals have a need for livelihood as well. And then ending on just equality, just the notion that equality isn't just for humans, but it's about giving equal consideration to all the interests of other species that we share the planet with. Okay, and then this is my last slide, where at the end of the book, I spend about a paragraph or two talking about each of these 13 projects. So a lot of these projects are things I see the groups already doing, and I'm just kind of packaging them together and saying, hey, if animal protection group wants to work with a human rights and or environmental group, or just support their causes and vice versa, here's a group of issues or things we need to work on society. We need all of these things addressed. And so, but I also think it's story ideas for you. And again, you probably are doing some of these things, but I'm trying to say that we might look at something and see it as just like about human rights or just about animals. But I think there's ways that promoting this list of things is beneficial for all movements. So just to quickly go through them, democratic reform, again, we're seeing this as more and more important, especially even in the United States, where we've seen a threat to voting rights and worrying about overreaches of presidential power and different kinds of things. And we also don't want corruption from corporate interests in our parliaments and senates and things. Economic system reform, this is just like at the heart of so many things is corporations and kind of a neoliberal economic system that's built on growth, and that usually means exploiting others. So can we transform or come up with a new economic system or new rules for corporations where they're not incentivized just to provide money for shareholders, but incentivized in ways that it's life-centered? Because right now, a lot of the things they're tasked to do in corporations are like anti-life and well-being. And so even if they don't mean to be, they end up being exploitative. Protection of biodiversity as well as biocultural diversity. So I became more familiar with this term, and this is just for how indigenous groups or minority groups, their language and culture is being lost, but also that's part of the land and the community where they're from. And so if we lose these groups and what they know about the land, it's not just biodiversity that's lost, it's biocultural diversity. Climate justice. So the climate crisis is a movement we all can get behind, especially around the notion of justice, meaning, okay, how are we going to adapt to all the problems that are going to be caused, and especially all the refugees that are going to be around the world? And these refugees are human and non-human, right? And so can we embrace them? How are we going to treat all these individuals? Sustainable food systems. This is near and dear to a lot of our hearts as well. The idea that we need to be moving towards plant-based food systems, grown sustainably, organically, and with a labor force who is well taken care of. Clean, healthy environments. And this is kind of an environmental justice issue in terms of who around the world is usually the groups of people who get put in the most danger and risk and have the most toxins around them. So the idea would be that whoever's creating the mess needs to clean it up. And it can't just be wealthy groups or corporations causing problems and then pushing those problems off, and the health risks off onto the poor communities. Economic equality and eradication of poverty. Just that this cannot continue. We can't continue in terms of such unfair sharing of resources. And there's ways that we can go about it. And you see groups like A Well-Fed World with Don Moncrief, where they're trying to get at some of these human issues in feeding people who and children who don't have enough nutrition, but doing so in a way that's not harmful to the planet and other animals. So green and animal friendly urban design. This is kind of fun. This is just thinking about all the ways we can better design our cities to have natural light and healthy spaces and allow more pedestrians and more public transit and tree canopy, and even allow our companion animals to be with us on public transit or in restaurants and different kinds of things. Because yeah, the weather, I mean, I don't really use public transit that much anymore since I'm usually have him with me. And I used to ride the train in Atlanta more than I do now because I can't, or even just using a bike is difficult when you have a companion animal. And then also with that urban design is making sure that we're being welcoming to the wildlife who also want to. The city is not just a boundary where all wildlife must stop. I mean, it's also an ecosystem. Female and ethnic minority empowerment. And so this is about like, let's have more female leadership around the world, especially women of color. I mean, it's their turn to take charge. And I also think a lot of us think that all these things will many positive things will happen if we get some new leadership in, as well as looking at our own organizations and making sure that we're treating everyone fairly, and also making sure that in the animal rights movement that we don't overlook inequities and discrimination against human groups when we're talking about an animal industry of some kind. And I think we've definitely started getting much better at that, and recognizing that all different kinds of discrimination should be called out, and we shouldn't be kind of ranking some as more important than others. Transformation from violent masculinity, probably enough said there, like you get it. Again, I think a lot of the problems that we see is because of a certain notion of hypermasculinity or a patriarchal kind of dominant worldview that led into this kind of economic system we have. And so if we lean towards a society that's either more gender neutral or embraces some more feminine aspects, we're going to, I think, naturally get at some of those more compassionate, more space for compassion and mental health and all these things. So it's good. This isn't an anti-male statement. It's an anti-hypermasculinity statement. Indigenous land rights and environmental stewardship. A lot of the environmental rights groups have really gotten into that lately. And there's in the post-colonial studies area, there's also a green post-colonial studies too, which I want to get more involved in, where we decolonize our mind. And as we talk about the exploitation of the land, we're considering like how we colonize land and individuals, human and non-human. So there's also just a different way to look at everything. And there's a lot of wisdom too that's been overlooked in the Western world, where we have privileged kind of European ways of doing things and overlooked a lot of other kind of cultural wisdom. These last two, I think, are the most challenging in terms of working together between human rights, environmental, and animal protection movements, abolition of enslavement and freedom from unfair imprisonment. Because we can definitely see on a human rights level, like, okay, we're doing these things and we need to keep doing them. And I think we do them within animal protection as well, but they're very set domains. But like, could a prison reform group or a group that is against kind of unfair biases in the criminal justice system also be against imprisonment of non-human animals in circuses and zoos or something like that? This has not been done. And so I think it's a harder area. So I'd be actually interested to talk more about that. Because I mean, yeah, we could keep talking about these things separately, because a lot of us also don't tend to use the word enslavement when we're talking about the way that other animals or non-human animals are held captive. And but it technically is a form of enslavement, but we also don't necessarily want to use a triggering term that's going to be ineffective. So we'll tend to say captivity or imprisonment, but I sometimes will throw in the notion of enslavement. And I tend to use the word enslavement and not slavery when I talk about what we've done to other animal beings. And I mention abolition of enslavement too, because there's millions of humans who are being forced into either sexual slavery or other kinds of forced labor around the world. And it's illegal, but it's happening everywhere, and it's rampant. So that's something that we also can be conscious of when we're talking about those held in captivity and treated unfairly, that these things are still happening with humans as well. So anyway, so that's a list of all the different things, and we could talk more about them. So this is just the end. I have my email address on here, cpfreeman@gsu.edu, and then the website humananimal.earthlings.com has some of the stuff that I'm talking about, and also some other interviews with me and different things are on there as well.
Thank you so much for
that. All
that.
right, well, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so we can have more of a discussion.
Yeah, definitely. The floor is open to anyone that's got questions. Nothing came in the chat. I think.
Oh, I can't hear you, Cammie.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, wait a minute. It might be my. Oh, wait. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you now. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it was my fault. Okay.
No worries. I was just saying, thank you for that awesome presentation. And I just wanted to open up the floor to questions. Nothing came through the chat, but I think it's quite a heavy topic that it deserves a face-to-face discussion. So yeah, if you have any kind of questions about anything that Carrie went over, please feel free to just speak up.
Yeah.
A few of us here, so.
Okay, I have a question.
Hey.
Hi, Carrie. Nice to meet you. Thank you for your presentation. I'm Lida Durango. I'm from Colombia, South America.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have currently we have a big conflict here in Colombia between animal rights groups and environmental rights. Environmental groups. Because. Okay, my city, the city where I live is Medellin. Yeah. The city of the infamous Pablo Escobar. In the 80s, 90s, he brought some species from Africa. One of those species were the hippopotamus. I don't know if that's the right, the right word in English. And right now we have a big problem here. Well, we animal rights activists, we don't consider it a problem, but environmentalists consider it a problem because they are endangering native species from Colombia, because they are not a species from Colombia. So it's a big conflict actually between animal rights activists, environmental activists, and we haven't found a way to work together on these kind of values that you were talking about. Can you give us any idea how to work this out, please?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think what you're talking about, like invasive species, or what I like to call introduced species, is probably a nicer way to put it. I definitely get into that in the book, because that I try to talk in the book about kind of areas of tension between human rights and animal rights, or animal rights and environmentalism. And I think one of the hardest things is what you just mentioned. And so there is the compassionate conservation movement, like that Mark Bekoff kind of puts forward, and Lori Marino. And that's starting to take off, where let's try to address conservation issues, but do so in a way that has an animal rights framework to it. Like, so like, I do think it's fair to say that problems probably are caused by these hippos being in Colombia, and that it does disadvantage some of this aquatic species, that are there. And hippos are very, and actually I was surprised to learn how aggressive they can be. And yeah, they're huge and, and powerful. So, but what Lori Marino and some of the activists in the book, when I interviewed them, what they talk about is saying, first, we need to recognize, like, let's have a non-lethal solution. Like, can we put that on the table? Because I like to say, can I treat them in a similar way that I would treat a human group who may be causing a problem, especially when they don't mean to be causing a problem? They're not like criminals running around like, oh, let's see how much damage I can do. So I do think the way, like I just put on the Facebook page for Animals and Media, our Animals and Media Facebook page, I just put an article from Australia that was demonizing feral hogs. And yeah, I recognize they do cause problems, but I mean, there was like a picture of a hog just like being himself running somewhere. And then the caption said, going off to do some damage. And I'm thinking, that's not what he's doing. I mean, you could say that about me when I go to the grocery store, something like using fossil fuels, trying to kill everyone, So it's like, well, that's not what I'm trying to do, but yeah, maybe I am doing damage. So I think, first of all, we need to say, like, okay, let's not kill them, or that's a absolute last resort, right? And let's respect them as individuals who were brought here through no fault of their own, and now they're just trying to live. And of course, many of us are colonists. Like, most of the people having these discussions in Colombia are probably, their families may have only been there 100 or 200 years, right? So I also kind of get into the book about the idea, even just around the notion of indigeneity. Like, of course, we want to embrace indigeneity when it comes to human groups, but then I worry about what that means for non-humans, because it kind of implies, like, well, if you're not from here, it's almost like demonizing refugees, or like if somebody's new to an area, well, then you shouldn't be here and you need to leave. So if you start kind of looking at things within a human rights realm, even when we're talking about non-humans, I think it frames things a little bit differently. Because obviously, and you all have a lot of people from Venezuela who are desperate, who have come over the border. And my friend Estella is Colombian and was telling me about it. And so, but we can't also demonize them as if they're just a problem and they're not individuals also who need to make a living and survive and thrive. So yeah, so I think just approaching it from like a humane problem solving way. But another thing is to recognize whether or not these animals really are doing damage. It's because you mentioned that before, just because they're not native to an area does not mean they need to be removed, because basically a lot of areas are resilient and species do move around. But yes, a lot of species move around because of human activity, especially over the last 300 years. But yeah, I mean, so is somebody really doing a lot of damage? And if so, is there a way, like maybe they could be relocated, or you could deal with birth control issues or something like that? But I think even determining whether or not it's really at risk. But I just really don't like a lot of the demonization of invasive species. I mean, they're just act like they should just be eradicated and slaughtered, like certain kind of non-native fish in some pond. So, and I think if I see myself, since I'm a basically a settler colonialist, in the United States, like I'm a non-native to this area. I'm doing damage, but I don't want someone to come along and kill me. I need to be reformed, or like, we have to find some other solution. I think it's really hard what you're dealing with. Yeah, I mean, like, so that's what I'm adding to the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lydia, and thank you, Carrie. That's actually all the time we've got, unfortunately.
Oh my God, I'm sorry I talked too long. I didn't mean
No,
to.
it was very insightful. And the good news is that, Carrie is on Mighty Networks on the sentient media community.
Yeah.
So if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to direct message her.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will also be putting this onto the community tomorrow, so we'll have a chance to kind of launch it. I just want to say thank you again so much.
Oh, thanks, Cami. Yeah, I hope that I picked things that I hoped would be like intriguing to you as writers, so that you could get ideas of ways that you could frame, like, build these values and show how they apply to multiple species at once and how we could work together. And so, because we really need strength in numbers with all our social movements, because we're going up against transnational corporations and governments and everything. And so we can't just be a series of little nonprofits all trying to kind of work in siloed ways. So finding ways that we can show that we have some similar values that we're trying to promote in society, but knowing that they apply to hippopotamuses as well as all of us is important. And so I really think the writing you're doing, you're like the perfect audience for this book to take some of these ideas and find ways to kind of enliven them for people. So thanks for listening and participating.
Amazing. Great parting words to leave us with. I hope you all have great afternoons or evenings, wherever you are in the world. And I hope to catch you in a couple of weeks for the next one.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
You.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
Nini. Good to see you again.
Bye, Dr. Carrie. We'll talk soon.
Bye.
Bye.